Well, Mahagonny exists in two forms. The Songspiel, which was written in 1927 for the Baden-Baden Music Festival, was done there, one performance, then done in Hamburg in 1930, and then never done in that form again during Weill's lifetime. The so-called Paris and Rome and London Mahagonnys were the Songspiel with some numbers from the big Mahagonny stuck in. But the big Mahagonny, the full-length 3-act opera, was premiered in Leipzig in March 1930, followed by productions in Kassel, Braunschweig, Prague, Frankfurt. Never got to Berlin because Klemperer and the other opera houses, the 3 opera houses, all declined it. So Weill finally got Ernst Josef Aufried, the producer of Threepenny Opera and Happy End, to do Mahagonny in the Theater am Kurfürstendamm as a privately financed production where it ran 50 performances in 1931, with the cast not primarily of opera singers, but a mixed cast, operetta singers. And that was the first production where Lenya sang the role of Jenny. Weill had to rewrite the role for her for that production. Wasn't musically unskilled. Zemlinsky conducted, so it was very high level of orchestra playing and music direction. Then that was the last production of the full-length opera during Weill's lifetime. So it had a time of about a year and a half when it could be performed. After that, there simply wasn't an opportunity in a major opera house to do it again. So then Lenya did it in Vienna in an hour-long version at a theater again. Then the so-called Paris Mahagonny took the Songspiel, and Marisa Bravanel took 3 numbers from the big opera that had small orchestration similar to the Songspiel, adapted that. And that was done in Paris and in London, a few performances. And that was it during Weill's lifetime. Nothing more of Mahagonny. In fact, when Lenya contacted Universal Edition after the war and said, "Where is Mahagonny?" The response was that the Gestapo had taken it and that the full score was gone. Now, I suspect they meant the autograph. I can't believe all the materials were gone. But she was inquiring because that was about 1955, and in 56, after the worldwide success of the Threepenny Opera here in New York, then the big recording frenzy started for all the Brecht-Weill works. And so Columbia decided with Phillips that they would do Mahagonny, and that was the first after Dragoschenoper that they recorded. And so that was the beginning of the second life of Mahagonny, was that recording, which entailed some silent new revisions for Lenya, because now Lenya was singing at least a fifth lower than she had back in 1931, when her voice was described as like a songbird, cool, light, radiant, like a sickle moon, by Ernst Bloch. But in 56, this was a voice 2 octaves below laryngitis, as she described herself. So this, on the one hand, was an echt Mahagonny, in that it was the first time that the whole opera had been done. Good conductor, Bruckner Bruggeberg, but then lots of adaptations so that Lenya could sing it, with no notation of that effect. She never sang it on stage after Weill died. So it was only that record that is there as her legacy for the performance tradition. First post-war full production, Darmstadt, 1957. And then it sort of made the circuit in Germany. Then something really unfortunate happened in 1963. The Berliner Ensemble decided that they would do Das kleine Mahagonny, and they didn't mean the Songspiel. What they did was to take the big opera, hire 3 musicians and sort of bastardize the whole thing, condense it into an hour, and pretend that it was the little Mahagonny. And Lenya let it be done as a favor to Brecht's widow, Helena Weill, for a while. But then when other theaters wanted to do it, she said no. And so to this day, that version has never been authorized for performance again. Then it started to establish itself in the major opera houses. And I remember very well 1979, the premiere at the Metropolitan Opera, Teresa Stratas as Jenny. This was a major milestone in the history of Mahagonny. When the Metropolitan Opera, James Levine, said, we're doing Mahagonny, then there was hardly any more debate after that. Is Mahagonny an opera? Yes, it's at the Metropolitan Opera. And after that, Hamburg and the Berlin opera houses and Salzburg and Madrid and so forth. And now upcoming, we know Covent Garden's going to do it, LA Opera's done it. So there are very few major houses in the world that haven't produced Mahagonny now. Well, the Songspiel was a commission for the Baden-Baden Music Festival, and it's only about 25 minutes long. And it's got a perfectly symmetrical structure. 4 men, 2 women. First number is Auf nach Mahagonny for the 4 men in German. Next number is Alabama Song for the 2 women in English. Then you have a number for the 4 men in German. Then you have Benares for everyone in English again. And in between each of these, you have instrumental interludes that are very Stravinskian, almost atonal. And it was done as a very provocative Songspiel, a play on Singspiel, the notion of the American popular song in the background, and scandalized a music festival where Webern and Schoenberg and Berg were getting their premieres too, and here's Weill and Mahagonny Songspiel set in a boxing ring. But strangely enough, there were only 2 performances of that piece during Weill's lifetime. One in 1927, and then Hamburg, 1930, something like that, and then never again, because no sooner had it been performed in Baden-Baden, or maybe even beforehand, Brecht and Weill had decided, hey, we're going to make a full-length opera out of this. And so the Songspiel went up on the shelf, and what Weill did was to take certain sections of it, so that we get the Alabama Song, but he recomposed it. He got rid of all the crunchy Bartokian dissonance in the accompaniment, simplified the harmonies, but interestingly made the vocal part much more operatic. So you get the obligato soprano part for Jenny, which isn't in the Songspiel at all, which is, it has a canon. You have 3 stanzas in the Songspiel, but only 2 stanzas in the full opera. So he recomposed the Alabama Song. Benares, God in Mahagonny, basically taken verbatim and put into the opera. And there are problems. In the Songspiel, it's just a series of 6 scenes with no plot, no connect the dots. In the opera, what do you do with these tableaus where you don't even know where they fit? I mean, should God in Mahagonny come before the execution or after the execution? And there's I mean, we know where Weill put it in the piano vocal score, but there's no compelling dramaturgical reason for it. It could go virtually anywhere. So the Songspiel sections that are simply stuck in are always a problem. How do you make them fit into the larger structure of the whole piece? And sometimes productions have omitted them. And I think there's a case to be made for that. Well, I think in the largest context, we're dealing with the unique situation with Brecht and Weill in that I can't think of another major playwright and a major composer who actually write opera or musical theater pieces together for, 8, 9 pieces. Suppose we could say Strauss and Hofmannsthal, but Hofmannsthal was no Brecht. Moliere and Lully, but they didn't really collaborate. This was a real collaboration. Every day they would get together and they would write. And with Mahagonny, this went on for about 2 years. And Weill and Brecht would work on the libretto for about a year together. Weill's not credited as co-librettist, but he talks all the time about how every decision was made and calculated because it was going to be set to music. So he was there. And he couldn't start writing the music until the libretto was done. In that sense, he's a lot like Sondheim, who hates to write a song until the whole play is done. In fact, he kids that he'd like to see the whole thing staged before he writes a number. And I think Weill would have liked to have seen that too. But anyway, by the time Weill wrote the music, it had become clear to Brecht that, hey, no matter what we talked about, the music is going to wash out all my ideas about epic theater and so forth. And so he didn't even go to rehearsals in Leipzig for the premiere. I can't recall if he even attended the premiere, but he didn't really care about the piece anymore. And that's what caused him to, as he did with Threepenny Opera and a number of his works with Weill, to publish his own version that took no account of the music whatsoever, that basically sabotaged what the joint work was by saying, this is what I would have written if it hadn't been an opera with Weill. And so he publishes in 1931 the text of Mahagonny, accompanied by an essay called Notes About Mahagonny, and it was co-authored with Peter Zurkam. And in this, he basically contradicts everything that Weill felt about the opera. And so it was a public display intellectually of what's going to happen later in the year in Berlin when they're going to do this production at Alfrick's Theater. And every day they're fighting about which should prevail, the music or the text, Weill or Brecht. Finally, one day, a photographer comes and says, I want you two in a photo. And Brecht refuses and says, I'm going to throw this phony Richard Strauss down the stairs. And Alfrick had to come in, the producer, and he said, okay, Brecht, I'm going to give you a theater. You produce The Mother in that, and let Weill and Neyer do Mahagonny here. And so their ideas at that point had diverged so completely, largely because Brecht was now very much into Marxist Lehrstücke, the idea that all plays should be didactic plays and should present the class struggle and so forth. Well, of course, Mahagonny isn't about that at all, and it's only layered on top of Mahagonny and Threepenny Opera in these literary versions. The problem is, if you're a director and you want to do Mahagonny, and you take Brecht's script from 31, and you take Weill's score from 30, the two don't match up, and you can't make them work. You have to use the text that was actually performed in 1930, not this antidote to the opera. John Willett the great Brecht scholar, used to say that Mahagonny was actually not authored just by Brecht and Weill, but by Brecht, Weill, and Caspar Neyer, the designer, who was really the brains behind what has come to be known as Brechtian staging or epic theater. All of what now we have a technical term for these things. We call them metadrama or metadramatic devices. And so the idea that you would project a text during a song with the lyrics, or you would have the performer come down to the footlights, put a light right overhead and say, song, and sing right to the audience, no pretense of realism. You'd expose the lighting instruments, the famous half curtain with the title written across it. All of these devices were meant to be anti-naturalism, anti-realism, anti-Stanislavskian theater with the fourth wall. The idea is that we're not pretending you're not in the theater. This is not a Wagnerian narcotic experience. You should always, it's like going to a boxing match or a circus. You know where you are, you're being entertained, but you're also being challenged to not be passive, to engage, cheer, be repelled, be alienated, but don't just sit there. And so I think that anyone who wants to do Brechtian staging today, if you copy all the things that Neyer did in 1930, what you get is a museum piece that doesn't shock or invite people to say, this is theater, this is illusion, it's not reality. When we have so many new technological advances that if Neyer had, he would have done, live video projections and you would have seen the set change magically in front of your eyes with every theatrical effect that you could imagine. And so if you put the half curtain on stage and then draw it back and forth, I just saw it at the Vienna State Opera, and it almost is laughable at this point. The Met did it too, as if that's the only way you can remain true to Brecht. And the best way to remain true to Brecht is to use the most imaginative technological possibilities of theater today to achieve the same effect that Neyer achieved. I think so, in that if you read Weill's own synopsis of the plot of Mahagonny, I think the word that occurs 14 times is the word city. And this is the rise and fall of the city, not of Jimmy and Jenny, not of the individuals. And he made a point of that this is not about the psychological portrayal of individuals, but rather a modern story, a story of a modern day Sodom and Gomorrah. The ills of society in the modern world and how that impacts on individual lives. So the emphasis is not on the relationship of Jim and Jenny psychologically, but what prevents them from connecting? What prevents them from living happily ever after, or even dying tragically, like most operas? Here, it's done sort of matter-of-factly. The right before Jimmy's executed, that chilling scene where he says, "Kiss me, Jenny," and she says, "Kiss me, Jimmy," and it's all pro forma. There's no emotion behind it. It's going through the motions. And I think that, yes, you have to have a subtext for the relationships, otherwise it becomes uninteresting. But one doesn't lose sight of the fact that the story is a modern morality tale. It is not primarily a Marxist critique of capitalism. Yes, of course, there's some of that in modern society, but it's also about excess of eating, of drinking, and the failure to have money to pay for it, of course. But to restrict it to any one thing in terms of Sodom and Gomorrah as seen in the 20th or 21st century, I think is to diminish the opera and to make it. I've seen it, for example, that every time Jenny came on stage, there was a suitcase of money that she was carrying, and there was a spotlight not on her, but on the suitcase of money. Now, that was interesting for about 14 seconds. And after 2-3 acts of this was about the worst idea I'd ever seen on stage, because there's much more to the piece than that. There is no recording of the opera, frankly. There are 2 recordings that approximate some aspects of the opera. And I think if there's one failure that I've had during my tenure as president of the Kurt Weill Foundation is not being able to see a full recording of the opera made with a really first-rate orchestra conductor and cast. Preferably one that had done it on stage as well, because it really does assume a great deal of immediacy after that. Lenya's recording, some wonderful things about it, but it's Lenya, and she could pull it off, but her handicaps are not something that one would want to imitate, and there have been many productions that want to cast Jenny with an actress who sings like Lenya, and it doesn't work. There was only one Lenya, there can't be another. She was a composer's wife, and sure, she made changes, but that's not repeatable. So the other recording is a studio recording that the VDR made back in the 1980s, I think, and it's mixed also. So if there's one thing that I'd like to accomplish in the next decade, it would be to get a really terrific recording of Mahagonny. Maybe with appendix, maybe when the new edition comes out, the critical edition, with all of the options for the various versions in an appendix, maybe like the Showboat recording that John McGlynn did. There are some compelling DVDs out, which maybe is almost as good as a recording, except most of them were filmed live, so that you can't fix some things that went wrong. So we now have on DV, I think, Salzburg, which I don't recommend. It was very badly directed and largely miscast. We have LA Opera, which was directed by the flavor of the moment at that point on Broadway, and he had no idea what to do with Mahagonny, but there's some very compelling performances, and I think James Conlon conducts a very compelling account of the orchestral part. Probably the best candidate right now is the Madrid Opera production from about, a year and a half ago? And that's now out on DVD. The staging, it has its ups and downs, but I think it's imaginative, and certainly musically it's probably the best of the three. One of the things we tried to do with this set of new materials, this isn't the critical edition, that's quite a ways down the line, but we wanted to have something in the interim that would allow conductors and directors to have the choices that they need to put together their version of Mahagonny, because there is no one Mahagonny. There will never be two productions that do exactly the same text, and I mean text, the musical text of Mahagonny, because there are too many choices to be made, too many options. Which Havana lead do you use? The one Weill wrote in 1931 for Lenya for the Berlin production, which is the more famous one now, or the one he did in the original, which is more Hindemithyan? Do you include the crane duet, which was originally a substitute for a scene that the censors wouldn't allow to be done? Now, if you can do that scene, where do you put the crane duet? Does it go in Act 3, where David Drew said it should go before the execution? Or in Act 1, at the beginning of the relationship, where it is on the VDR recording, I think, and where Josef Heinzelmann thought it should go. And there may be other places. So we had it originally in Act 2, Drew puts it in Act 3, and I know of a spot where it could go in Act 1. So it's a fairly wide range of dramaturgical function for that piece. If you do the crane duet, which is very much in neoclassical style, it's almost Bachian, then do you want to have that paired with the Alabama song that's in the same, or not the Alabama, the Havana lead that's in the same style, or do you want to contrast it? Then you have to decide if you're going to put in Benares and Gaten Mahagonny, where are they going to do and what function are they going to play? are you going to do it in 2 acts or in 3 acts? It was written in 3 acts. If you do it in 3 acts, do you put the Jimmy's aria, Nur die Nacht, at the end of Act 2, which is where it was originally? Or do you move it to the beginning of Act 3, as in the 69 score, and where Weill moved it, I think, actually for the second production, the one in Kassel? And if you do, it makes a huge difference how you want to end Act 2, because you can't just stop if you move Nur die Nacht. So we present these options along with all of the known authorized cuts in various musical numbers as well. And we invite conductors and directors to make informed decisions that fit their circumstances and their concept for the production. Another big decision that conductors have to make is, what is the instrumentation of the orchestra? In Weill's full score, his autograph, next to the string section, he puts in front of the violin, viola, cello, bass, 6, 3, 2, 2. We don't know when he wrote that there. We don't know if it refers to players or stands. And we don't know if that was for a small theater like the Berlin production, where the pit size would have been very small, constricted, or whether he meant that for Leipzig. I did get to ask Abravanel about it, because Weill went to Kassel. Abravanel had been his pupil, so I figured Weill would tell him what he wanted, and Abravanel said, "Are you kidding? We use the full orchestra, the full string section, and we're an opera house." And Weill said yes. So I've heard it done with just 6 players at the Metropolitan Opera with their full brass complement, and the 6 string players or violin players could have just as well stayed home. And there was no presence to the sound. If you're in a 3,300 seat house, you can't do this piece with 6 violins. I think, again, you have to look at the circumstances and find the right size string section to balance everything else under those acoustic circumstances. It's, again, not cut and dry. Informed choices are what need to be made. Well, I think we have to put Lenya aside, because that was a unique case. Weill was very clear that he thought Mahagonny was an opera. Let me quote from 2 letters. This is one from before the premiere in February 1930. He said to Abravanel in a letter, "Mahagonny is an opera for singers. To cast it with actors is absolutely impossible. Only when I specifically have marked it as spoken should there be any spoken words, and any kind of changes are possible only with my explicit permission." I don't know of any clearer statement than that. Then after the performance there in May later that year, he said, "People who know only the libretto have spread the rumor that Mahagonny could be cast with actors. Of course, that would be absolutely impossible." So here we are, 80 years later, and we still get people trying to have Jenny cast with somebody who has to sing it down an octave, who has to speak most of the role, or you get someone in the chorus to stand next to her to sing the high stuff. Why? There are opera singers who can act these days, and I mean, it's just silly. I don't know. I guess it does come from Lenya, but I think anyone who's sung the part will tell you that it is a challenge, and it's no accident that most of the great Lulus of the second half of the 20th century did Jenny as well, and found the role somehow simpatico, and in the same Fach vocally. And I once talked to John Vickers about why he didn't sing Jimmy. He said, Jimmy is tougher in the voice than Tristan. I said, tougher than Tristan? He says, yeah. He says, it's not the high C at the end of Nur die Nacht that's so hard. It's all the G's before that, one after another, just constantly, F, G, F, G. By the time you get to the high C, there's nothing left. He said, I could do it on a recording, but he said, I couldn't do it night after night in the opera house. He said, it would kill me. No, I think you take really strong singing actors, and the world is full of them. And I've seen wonderfully compelling Mahagonnys in the opera house. And I've also, my first Mahagonny came in 1974. I think it was the fourth production in the United States. First was the terrible one on Broadway that Carmen Capalbo did that closed after one official performance but ran for 90 previews while Lenya and Stefan Brecht were in court trying to close it. And then they finally let it open, and then it closed immediately once the critics came. Then the second one was San Francisco Spring Opera, and then Washington Opera, and then Mahagonny was done by the Yale Repertory Theater. And they brought in singing actors, and it was very much, I think, in the spirit of the Berlin production of 1931, that these weren't primarily opera singers, but most everyone was a good enough singer that they could actually sing it as written. My mother-in-law was Begbik, and so I was there every night for every rehearsal and I guess 29, 30 performances, so that's where I learned every note of Mahagonny. And to this day, being done in a 700-seat theater with real actors, and Alvin Epstein directed and Otto Werner Müller conducted, that was a pretty impressive Mahagonny. But I've also saw, Ingo Metzmakers in Hamburg, and Ruth Berghauses, and Marcus Stenz did it in Stuttgart. Brilliant performances, with not a weakness in the cast. After Jimmy gets sentenced to death for not paying his bar tab, I think there's a line by the announcer, the narrator, that says something to the effect, I wager that the love of money in our own time is so great that none of you would volunteer to pay his debt either. And that always gets, when delivered properly, it always gets a nervous laugh from the audience. Sort of a spine-tingling one, because it's the moment where the spotlight turns off the stage right out on the audience. And I don't think that there's any question that the fact that Mahagonny's life cycle as a stage piece has its times where very few theaters do it, and then all of a sudden everybody's doing it. And I think if we actually plotted that out with things like worldwide recessions and wars and conflicts and so forth, I think that you'd see a correlation. It may lag behind 3 or 4 years, but I don't think it's any accident that right now Mahagonny is enjoying one of its most populated times, where, at any given season, 8, 10 opera houses are doing Mahagonny, and that's probably more than at any other time in its history. So I think that's directly related to our times and the relevance of Mahagonny to culture today and worldwide global capitalism and the inhumanity that comes with the territory. Well, that's a tough question. Of course, the scene of God in Mahagonny is that God comes and tells them what to do, and the people of Mahagonny say, 9! And basically we're seeing the death of God before our eyes, and I suppose you could then say that that metaphor extends to the death of Deus ex machina, because what happens right after that is the finale, which a number of conductors have likened to the end of Götterdämmerung. So what is the message there? There is nothing that can help a dead man, nothing that can help him or us or you. And I think God in Mahagonny connects right to that moment. And that is the final view of the wages of sin in a modern day Sodom and Gomorrah as the city goes up in flames and people march aimlessly with conflicting slogans, that there is no way out unless we find one, because there are no pat answers. Which is why the ending of Mahagonny, to me, is so disturbing, so overwhelming, and it's no accident. I mean, it's always trivialized by most conductors, where they take the funeral march, yum, da-da-da-dum, da-da-da-dum, and they keep at that tempo or increase it to the end, whereas Weill marks più largo as we get closer to the end, more slowly, more weight, and then molto largo, and it should be conducted in 8, and it really is the end of the world at that point as we know it, and it has to carry the full weight of a Mahler funeral march at that point. And Mahler was one of Weill's two gods, Mozart and Mahler, and if you can conduct Mahler, you can probably conduct Weill. And maybe even if you can conduct Mozart, you can conduct Weill.